Hello, subscribers. People keep complaining that I, quote, defend slavery, but they fail to make a clear distinction about what slavery actually is. Because to use a ridiculous and obviously wrong definition, for example, if slavery was defined as making people happy, then what would be the problem with defending it? From what I've seen, people do not have a good definition of slavery when they condemn it. So with this video, I'm hoping to get us all on the same page and define slavery properly, and especially explain how the Bible defines it, because obviously that's really the whole point anyway. If the Bible never mentioned slavery, it wouldn't really matter if people had weak definitions. So of course we need to look at how the Bible uses the term. But that will make it take me a lot longer to actually make this video. But we shall see. Future Toads Eat X. Here it turns out I'm actually not going to look at how the Bible uses the word because I'm lazy and a serial procrastinator. Also because after looking at the dictionary definitions, I concluded that the Bible isn't really that far off, so there really didn't seem to be a point. I will, however, try to answer the question of whether the Bible condemns or condones slavery, or whether it's neutral on the issue. Okay, back to the video. Let's define
slavery.
So let's start with my paper dictionary. Slavery is 1, the state of being a slave, bondage. 2, the practice of owning slaves. 3rd, a condition of hard work and subjection. That definition doesn't seem particularly useful one way or the other, so let's look at the word slave. A slave is 1 bound in servitude as the property of a person or household. 2, one who is abjectly subservient to a specified person, emotion, or influence. First off, I gotta say right off the bat that second definition might be a winner other than the use of the word abjectly, that one definitely fits in with what I expect to find in the Bible. If someone is going to argue that it's wrong to be a slave, they will have to point to the first definition and argue that it is wrong to consider a person as property. But who says it's wrong for a person to also be property? And notice I said also, because any definition of slave or slavery that has a person being merely property is to overstep the definition. Person and property are not mutually exclusive terms. In fact, property isn't mutually exclusive to most things. My house is my property, but it is still a house and subject to all that entails. Even if a person is property, they are still a person and subject to all moral considerations that a person is due. So again, who says it's wrong for a person to be someone else's property? Perhaps you could argue that God says it's wrong somewhere, but I'm not sure he does. And even if he does, that would just make it an internal debate. What standard does the atheist have to call slavery wrong? Nothing that I can see, just more standing on God's lap in order to slap him in the face. Now what about dictionary.com? Well, I don't like how the first definition is phrased, and this actually goes back to the other definition as well. But slavery is not a condition, or a state. That's just not how we use the word. What it is an institution or a practice. Being a slave is a state or a condition, not slavery. The next 3 definitions work much better, though the third one sounds more like it's describing a slang usage of the word. And we see not much difference so far. But if we scroll down, we see what the site calls a synonym study, and it includes what could be considered another definition. That is, involuntary subjection to another or others. I think the involuntary aspect is what people really don't like about it, and that is the hidden definition they are bringing into every conversation on the topic. So we have to ask the question, is slavery involuntary by definition? Personally, I think it can be voluntary, but since this seems like it will be the crux of the issue, I'll save my argument till after I've looked at everything else. Just to be thorough, we can look at the definition of slave as well, and it lines up pretty well with what we already looked at, except it includes the idea that a slave provides unpaid labor. This may become important later, but I don't know if I want to accept that aspect of the definition whole cloth, even though it would be pretty convenient when looking at how the Bible uses the word. Because even without the idea of using this labor to pay off debts, thereby making it paid labor, you could still consider room and board a form of payment, albeit very minimal payment. If I had to choose, I think involuntary works better than unpaid, but I'm not sure yet if I can accept either one. Before I move on to how the Bible uses the term, there was one more definition I've come across. Not from a dictionary, but from a comment on a video. I don't remember which video or if it was even my own, but the definition went something like servitude forced under penalty of violence, or something like that. And at first glance, this seems like a good definition that we can all say is wrong. But upon further reflection, I don't think this is actually defining slavery, but how the slavery is achieved. Would you really want to say that a person forced to be a servant or face jail time is not slavery just because jail time is not violence? I don't think you would, so the penalty cannot be a part of the definition. Okay, let's see if the Bible either condemns or condones slavery. Right out the gate, I can say pretty confidently that the Bible does not condemn slavery. It condemns mistreatment of slaves, but not the practice itself. Online, you can find several Christians who would argue that the Bible condemns slavery, but they are making the same mistake as the people who argue it condones it. They are assuming a faulty definition that includes the treatment of slaves, rather than the actual definition we looked at earlier. Also, Paul says we should be slaves of righteousness. An odd thing to say if you wanted to condemn slavery whole cloth.
Do you not know that if you present yourselves to anyone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one whom you obey, either of sin, which leads to death, or of obedience, which leads to righteousness? But thanks be to God, that you who were once slaves of sin have become obedient from the heart to the standard of teaching to which you were committed, and having been set free from sin, have become slaves of righteousness.
Now, it gets a little trickier when we ask, does the Bible condone slavery? Because most of the time I would say no. It just records it as something that happens and doesn't comment on whether the practice is good or bad. But there are circumstances where it can be preferable, such as slavery instead of execution. However, wisdom must still be used. So God did not allow Israel to become a slaving nation because too many slaves, and they rebel. So while it may be better for an individual to be a slave rather than die, the nation takes priority over the individual. So it's better for POWs to be executed rather than let them build up to dangerous levels. And again, of course, we have Paul saying we should be slaves of righteousness. But I would say this is Paul condoning a particular master, not the practice of slavery. The way Paul speaks in this passage indicates that slavery is inevitable. You're going to be a slave to something, so choose your master well. So I would say the Bible neither condemns nor condones slavery. However, I don't really have a problem if it did condone it because, as I am pointing out in this video, there is nothing inherently wrong with slavery. And I don't believe anyone can show it to be wrong without conflating the condition of being a slave with the treatment of said slave. So that brings us to the question of whether slavery is involuntary by definition. Well, the quick answer is no, and it's pretty easy to prove. If slavery was involuntary by definition, then it would be impossible to sell yourself into slavery. The very act of volunteering to be a slave would mean that even if your offer was accepted, you wouldn't be a slave. So of course, slavery cannot be defined as involuntary servitude. And that same answer can also be similarly applied, the question of whether slavery can be unpaid by definition. Is there anything wrong with a slave getting paid? Let's say slavery is legal, which it actually is, but I'll get to that later. And I have a slave and I just decide to start giving him money for his own use. Is he no longer a slave just because I give him money on a regular basis? I would say no, he is still a slave. And I hope you would too, because I don't know how to make it any more clear that whether they are paid or not is not a defining characteristic of slavery. It is just a common association that slaves are unpaid, but it is not a requirement of the word itself. Now, I could probably end the video right there, but I have to point out that slavery is not actually illegal. Only a particular form of slavery, which is just haphazardly called slavery. The vast majority of our jobs are a form of slavery. We go to work and clock in, and from then until we clock out, we are the slaves of whatever company we work for. We do not own our time for those 8 or more hours. The company owns it, and I do not see any distinction between owning my time and owning me. We have the freedom to quit at any time, of course, but that freedom is limited, or an illusion. We need the money. Our bills chain us to an employer, to a master. Most of us cannot survive without chaining ourselves to a master that can provide us the means to survive. Slavery is inevitable. We will always be subservient to someone or something and be forced to carry some burden, but some burdens are lighter than others. Choose your master well.